who is joining us for our live stream today on our YouTube channel, IDM Vienna. In our next IDMonSite, we have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Grigorij Mesežnikov. Dr. Grigorij Mesežnikov is political scientist, founding member, and currently in Bratislava, Slovakia. So, non-resident fellow of the Europe's Futures program at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Dr. Mesežnikov has published various monographs, collections, expert studies, and is regularly contributing with his political analysis to domestic but also to foreign media. Mr. Mesežnikov, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Daniel. It's my big pleasure to take part in this talk. And thank you to Institute for Danube region and Central Europe. Really, I very highly evaluate the work of your institute. I participated in some events, and now I have this unique opportunity to talk with you about current developments in Slovakia for those who are now watching us.
Thank you very much. We are glad to have you for our IDM talk today. So let's start with our discussion. So my very first question would be, we know that parliamentary elections took place at the end of February in Slovakia, and we witnessed, let's say, quite impressive victory of Igor Matovič and his party Olano. He was then charged to form a government by President Zuzana Čaputová, and that government eventually came into office. I think it was on 20th or 21st of March.
Yes.
And it was exactly in the middle of the global pandemic, coronavirus pandemic. So perhaps we could not imagine a worse situation for government taking the office. Could you comment on this? Could you comment on the COVID-19 situation in Slovakia and on these measures which were put in place by the former government in the first weeks of the pandemic, but also about the measures introduced by the new government? What are these measures? What were these measures? And what was the response or reaction of the Slovak public on these restrictions?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. Really, Slovakia is only a European country in which replacement of the government after the elections happened. And there were some concerns among experts, among journalists, maybe some citizens, whether this replacement will have place smoothly. It happened really smoothly, and it's one of the positive sides of the whole development. There are some political consequences for this. I can elaborate more. I mean, what it meant for the outgoing government and the new government. But the situation in Slovakia, I think, in comparison with some other countries, is relatively positive. The first government conducted some measures which started the whole process of reaction to coronavirus. And the new government continued in this. Now we have the regime of extraordinary situation. It's not emergency state, but it's regime of extraordinary situation. So it means that people are mostly in self-isolation. There are some restrictions for the movement. Of course, we are not traveling similar as Austrians and citizens of other countries. I mean, through over the borders. There is special regime for facilities, for shops, for cultural facilities, public events, performances, seances were shut down. There are restrictions in movement through the country, of course, but people, and it was one of your questions which you put me, that people more or less accepted all measures conducted by the first government and the second government. Polling agency Focus conducted, I mean, I think at maybe at the end of the March opinion poll, surveying the attitude of the population to the measures conducted by two government cabinets, and both these cabinets were perceived in positive manner. Then, quite surprisingly for me, I have to say that all these self-limiting measures which government of Igor Matovič, when it started to continue all these, measures conducted, that huge majority of population agreed. So government imposed self-restricting or limiting measures, conducted these steps, but the population accepted this. I know that the same phenomenon is in Czech Republic. I hope that I am not wrong. It has, of course, its explanation, various explanations, some socio-political explanations, but I think that the main factor here is a unique situation and really concerns and fears of people. And I was surprised by this data, sociological data, but what is really very positive, what I evaluated as a positive development, that people are expressing their solidarity, and not only on the words, but also by doing something, helping elderly people, abiding the regime of self-isolation. And I think that the statistical results I can now mention, they are quite impressive. For our country, we know that it's not still the peak of this pandemic, but we have in Slovakia so far identified, so registered only 14 deaths, so 14 persons dead. And we have a number of infected persons. It's slightly higher than 1,200. So, of course, partially it can be a problem that the testing is not so intensive as maybe in some other countries. But now the number every day, the number of tests is growing. But I think that concerning the deaths, it's absolutely credible number, which government every day is releasing additional data, and I think that 2-3 days we didn't have any even deaths.
Yeah. I see. Okay, so I think it's quite a low number also when we compared these numbers, for example, to Czech Republic. You mentioned this human solidarity. I think when we once again return to Czech Republic, we could observe that one of the signs of this solidarity was production of homemade face masks at the first weeks of the spread of the coronavirus in Czech Republic. Could one also something similar observed in Slovakia?
Yeah, I think that for practical reason, really Slovakia didn't have enough of these masks, and many people really produced domestically. Maybe not in so huge scale as it was in Czech Republic. I think in Czech Republic it became a kind of national wave of behavior of people. People were informing about this. People were communicating about this. In Slovakia, maybe it wasn't in so huge scale, but I know many people who proposed those who missed this mask that they can deliver to them. I think it was also a quite good example of solidarity. And people are abiding, in everyday life, these new technical norms. For example, this social distance, these 2 meters. The distance of 2 meters is really followed by all people in front of shops, for example, or in some informal gathering when people are going to the streets. They are trying to be, as long as possible. There are no any so far at least any signs of disobedience or disagreement. Of course, different people have their different habits, but so far I think that from this point of view, security situation in Slovakia is quite good, I would say.
Okay, and when we speak about the public reaction on these measures, because in Czechia there was a huge discussion about crossing the borders. I mean, like the commuters and cross-border workers working abroad. Uh, of course, the borders were closed down, and there was a big discussion if it should be open for these cross-border workers or should it be open only for healthcare staff and medical staff. Was also a similar discussion taking place in Slovakia?
Daniel, it's huge debate here in Slovakia because quite substantial part of the population, especially in this part of Slovakia, in western part of Slovakia, people are traveling, pendling between Slovakia and Hungary in both sides. There are some Slovaks who live in Hungarian or Austrian villages, small communities, but every day they are coming to Bratislava to work. So they have their offices, they live there, and of course, the vice versa. People who live in Bratislava, but they are pendling to Austria mostly, but also to Hungary. And fortunately, just in these days, government is softening conditions for those who are employed or who has some job engagement in neighboring countries. I know that the first country will be just Austria. There were some considerations that government probably together with, both governments will introduce the special procedure of testing these pendlers. But I think that technically, it seems that technically it's not fully implementable to provide really the 100%, sure that the person is not infected. And I think yesterday Prime Minister Matovič said, because officially it was the measure was approved with this provision about this testing, but Igor Matovič, Prime Minister, said that let pendlers wait for the situation, and probably they would simply avoid this testing because it's technically very challenging, very demanding. It's not the credible confirmation about the real infection, but it's a positive sign. I think it's after days and days and weeks of only strengthening the measures. Now the first softening measure will be, in regard to these pendlers.
Okay, so the current situation is that we are going to face easing or relaxing the situation in Slovakia right now. I think it was like also last week or this week when Prime Minister presented a certain plan how to open everything, reopen everything, shops, services, and so on. Could you maybe comment a little bit on that?
Yes, this plan consists from 4 sequences with 2 weeks interval. So since I think tomorrow or maybe even today, the first sequence will be introduced, and there are specific definition of the subjects or areas which will be gradually opening. So it means that the whole process will take at least 3 weeks, and then there are some schemes. According to the schemes, government will decide either to proceed further, to continue these softening measures, or probably just to stop, or even in the case of worsening situation, to return to the previous. So there are some mathematical models which government, it's a so-called median data of the infected persons. And there is special list in all of these, in each of these 4 sequences. There is a special list of facilities, areas, institutions in different sphere of public life, economy. So people are more optimistic now. I think it was very important, and it was more or less the common opinion of experts that it's really good to have the plan, even if this plan will be amended or maybe changed, or maybe in some situations stopped for implementation. But it's very important to inform people, how the life will be in the next, in this case, several weeks. And I think that after completing of this 4 sequence period, government will continue with the further plan.
I see, and I can completely understand that there is a huge pressure on the state economy when it comes to all these measures and so on. And I think I wrote an article that it's going to be already this week that, because similar to Czech Republic, car production also
Yes.
represents a large share of the economy, but also of the labor market. And I think they are going to reopen their factories, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. I mean, in this newly formed coalition, it was quite hard dispute between Prime Minister, who presented his ideas preferring first of all the health of people, so smaller numbers of deaths. It was his absolute priority. But at the same time, the more, I would say, libertarian part of the ruling coalition, SIS party, Freedom and Solidarity, and the Minister of Economy, Richard Sulik, he was rather presenting the ideas that, of course, health is very important, but economy shouldn't die. So we have to provide conditions for the gradual opening of the economy. And this dispute was in the last 2 weeks very harsh. And these two members of parliament, they were sending to each other messages with quite critical assessment of the situation. But good thing at the end is that they agreed, I mean, upon this this plan, which is now the real step. So it's not only, as I said, not only strengthening the measures, but also relaxing. So it means that it's very small step, but nevertheless, it's step to normality.
I see. So how would you assess the Slovakian crisis management in general? Are they doing well, or?
Well, I think from what I really see, I would say on the everyday base, not only on the presentations of the politicians, but the real steps done by the government. Some even laws were approved during this very short period of time of this electoral cycle of parliament. I think I evaluate this positively. Of course, we don't know what is the situation in some sectors of society after long-term governance of the previous ruling coalition. Prime Minister Matovič is quite critical. I think it was logical that when he was taking over the office, he was speaking that he de facto found the empty budget, the empty institutions. I don't think that it was really 100% true, but it's true that, and today especially, it's clear that the previous government wasn't, I would say, it was surprised so much that some of the measures which they started to do, government of Pellegrini, they didn't have this effect, the practical effect. And for example, the case of this system of material reserves, when Matovič, it was his first step, de facto, the first direction in activity in the prime minister position, visit to this state system of material reserve. And really he found there very unpleasant, very unfavorable situation, absolute lack of protective products, masks, other things. And the guy who was welcoming him as a new prime minister today, just absolutely fresh information, he was indicted, he was accused in criminal activities. So not only low efficiency of work of this institution, but also quite credible suspicions about corrupt practices in work of this institution. But generally, again, just to summarize, I think that government is performing relatively efficiently. Population is abiding. Epidemiological situation is at least not worsening very much. We will see how it will be in the next weeks, because still it's the peak will come probably in the either beginning or mid of May. So we have several weeks to see, how this virus will be spreading, and when more people will be tested. Today it's roughly 3,000 tests a day. It's much more than it was before. I mean, when government introduced itself, maybe 100 or 200 tests. I mean, even for so small country like Slovakia, it was very low number. But today it's higher, but it's still maybe not enough to have the complete idea about the situation, epidemiological situation.
And maybe what could be also interesting for the audience, how does it work actually when we have two governments in this extraordinary difficult times? How does it function when it comes to crisis management? Does these people were within the crisis or was there actually crisis management when the former government was still in the office?
Well, yeah, they create special, body, special staff in Slovak. So Pellegrini also, they have this special, but I would say only embryonic form. I have to say that the previous government, I think, of course, it's not only typical for Slovakia, but the previous government, I think, underestimated the situation in January, but even in February. In February, it was clear that this pandemic is coming to Europe, but I think that the government, of course, to understand better why not only the government but also opposition at that time, opposition which in March became the government, somehow didn't put enough attention. It was 1 month of electoral campaign, so you can imagine attention of all politicians are diverted to electoral agenda, to party competition, polls, meetings with supporters, performance, electoral, messages. And so it means that the main topic was elections. But there were some experts. Who warned and audience that the situation is really very serious. I have to name one person because thanks to his activities, some officials, not on the central level, but on the regional level, started to do something. And this person is Grigorij Mesežnikov. Grigorij Mesežnikov is a famous Slovak civic activist, writer, specialist on global trends. He is a medical doctor by training, and he was involved in the first period of democratic transformation in Slovakia as a representative of Green Party. And then years and years he worked for World Bank, and he is following the situation in the world. He knows how pandemic is spreading. And when he studied the first data from China, he immediately understood that it's not just the local epidemic, that it's something which has the potential to spread. And even, China is so remote country for us, but somehow he knew that all other countries are, taking into consideration how this virus is behaving, that it's risky for us. And he was writing articles, he was posting his articles, and maybe the attention wasn't enough high, but when at the beginning of March, it was clear that the first cases on infected persons occurred here, he started to really warn very loudly, and he suggested to the governor of Bratislava's region to shut down immediately the schools. And that time government did nothing. Government was rather communicating but did nothing. And when Juraj Droba, who is Bratislava region governor, decided to shut down the schools, all other regions started to join. So regional governance of other regions de facto continued in this line, and it was the process which opened the introduction of these administrative measures and then lately even legislative measures. But so it means that the former government, they had 3 weeks for this. The first week was almost, they were absolutely inactive, but then the two the latest weeks of their performance in the government, yeah, they started to do something. And then Matovič came, and Matovič, I mean, today he is the leader of the whole efforts of the country to respond to coronavirus.
So, from what you just said, the closing down of schools wasn't performed on the national level, but more on the subnational level.
Yeah, exactly.
Like
Bratislava
the
region.
regions. Okay. So the Bratislava region was the first one, and then the other followed.
Then I think that Bratislava as a city joined, and then other regions. Bratislava is formally part, of course, of Bratislava region, but the schools who are subordinated to the region, they are outside of the Bratislava. They're in smaller cities.
I see.
But the process was started. It was very important, and maybe partially it's definitely one of the reasons why so far we have so low number of deaths.
I see. And when we are also speaking about subnational measures, I think it would be good also to mention the measures which were taking place in the Roma communities. I mean, I think everyone already knew before that these communities, these Roma settlements, are vulnerable not only in times of crisis, but that they are vulnerable to certain kind of diseases and so on, because the people there are living under terrible, life-threatening circumstances. So when we speak about crisis management and about these settlements, did maybe the new government a little bit also underestimate this issue and the Roma population and returning Roma people to these settlements and actually spreading the COVID-19 disease?
Well, it's quite hot, and I think the sensitive issue, not only from epidemiological point of view, but also from political point of view. There are different aspects. The first aspect you mentioned, of course, it's very unfavorable social situation in this segregated Roma communities with a very low level of social services, bad quality of, everyday needs, running water, canalization, all this stuff, and especially the living conditions. It's very difficult. I cannot imagine. Several times I was in such settlements, and I cannot imagine how to provide the social distance, social distancing in the smaller. It's not even houses, smaller facilities for living, with a quite high number of people living in this small. So it's not easy thing. Then it's one aspect. So the general situation. Another aspect is that some members of these communities, they are just these pendlers. So I don't know, how to quantify this, but maybe several persons of the population of each, let's say, these communities, they are different. There are segregated hundreds of inhabitants and several thousands of inhabitants, and then they are pendling. So they are, especially when they were returning to these communities from abroad. Probably there were some, cases of spreading infection in these communities. And then Igor Matovič, he did some steps which were, I think, controversial from the point of view of reaction of the population, because when he justified the strengthening of the measures, he said that, look, to Roma community, we don't know what the situation there, we cannot allow to spread infection from these communities, and of course, taken into consideration that the Roma issue is, politically is very sensitive, and we have the real, racism in relations of attitude of the population, some part of the population to Roma. So it could provoke, of course, a negative, negative perception. Then, of course, Igor Matovič tried to explain his position that he just cares about Roma. So for him, it's important to provide them better conditions for health services, and he consulted with the experts, and then some measures, quarantine measures were introduced. So some these communities were isolated. According to information published in the media, they will organize some special, services for those who de facto remained there, maybe not absolutely physically locked, but with no normal access, let's say, to shops, to some other facilities, and then regional or local self-governments provided. So improved these conditions, but some of these communities are still in quarantine. So it's quarantine, and persons really were identified. But I have to say that the expectations that the whole population of this village was infected simply didn't confirm. So it's not true. Even it was one case when one maybe not segregated, but separated because there are different types of Roma community. Separated community, so community which is formed by the Roma citizens, but on the territory of the village, of the community. And when the people were tested, and nobody was identified as an infected person, but there were identified persons in the village itself. So it means among the Roma population. And then the mayor of this Roma community somehow complained that, look, you thought that we are infected, but now we are in fear. We are afraid of spreading this infection from our, it's not maybe politically correct, but it's used, unfortunately, it's used in Slovakia, that from white inhabitants of the village, that they can infect us.
I see. And I think this testing is performing by the army doctors, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, in these particular areas. Yes, in these particular areas, because the situation was declared as extraordinary in this part of the region, it's in Prešov region. And army is helping, but army plus some mobile groups of the physicians, medical doctors, and assistant social workers.
And how did the Roma people reacted on these measures, that there are soldiers coming to their settlements, and what was the atmosphere there?
Very mixed picture. Of course, the government is trying to explain how it's. There are some rumors which were spreading among Roma population that the real purpose of this testing is kind of vaccination, which can cause some problems to their health. So it means that, it's extraordinary situation. But so far, at least, I'm following every day reports, and I didn't register the real problems which would mean to, let's say, kind of disagreement or I don't know, maybe disobedience or revolt, nothing like this. But I know the situation is complicated, so it means that it's a huge challenge for people who are working there. But the fact that in some these villages, the bigger part of population was tested, I think that it's a positive development, of course.
Okay, thank you. And I think also this development is also challenging for people that are working in retirement home, because I think many cases of positively tested on COVID-19 was from one house for elderly people.
From two houses, but now government are trying to provide testing of bigger number of this. The official name is it's a house of social service. It's a house for pensioners. And it's approximately 4,000 people living in these houses. I think that probably half of those people who died, they were patients of this or inhabitants of these houses. Well, it's an uneasy situation for those people who live in these houses, because many of them still have members of family, and emotionally they are quite vulnerable, and now they do not have opportunity to personally, physically, I would say, offline communicate with their, I don't know, children or maybe grandchildren. And of course, I can imagine how difficult the situation is now for these people. But I think that the regime which was introduced is preventing any, I would say, intrusion from outside of any persons to these houses. But it seems that also people who are working there, I think, at least in case of this Pezinok, it's near Bratislava, case in which several people died. Probably the workers, they were probably infected, and then they somehow infected those who live in.
And is there a sufficient amount of these fast testers on COVID provided by the government, or if it's not the case, how they are dealing with this situation? Are they buying this medical?
Certain problem with the capacities, and I think that government is trying to use as credible as possible tests, because there are the so-called speedy tests, and they are not very credible. And government is now trying to make tests only with this credible, procedure, credible protocol. Well, I don't know exactly, what are the real capacities of the country. Positive thing is, health system of the country. Positive thing is that government allowed private companies to do these tests. So, but still, mostly the majority of tests are made by the special units in hospitals, in infection departments. What I'm reading in newspapers is that still it's not enough. Even this, the 300 was the goal, the preliminary goal of the government, to provide 3,000 a day. So now they are doing this 3,000 a day, but taking into consideration that the peak is just coming. Yeah. I think that they should somehow, I don't know, maybe double or maybe triple even the number of these tests.
Let's hope it will work in the future. So if we go a little bit back to politics, or from the more political perspective, the new government, the Igor Matovič government, is considered to be, let's say, politically reload after many years of Smer Social Democracy party in power in Slovakia. And many Slovaks are now expecting, let's say, harsh anti-corruption measures, cleaning up of politics, destroying all these structures connected with shady practices and so on. I know it's a sensitive topic, but abusing of the power, it's a big issue in Slovakia especially after the murder of Jan Kuciak and Martina Kušnírova in February 2018. So my question would be, how much will this process, if any, be affected by the current pandemic situation? What we can expect in the foreseeable future when it comes to these political issues and to the anti-corruption activities of the new government?
Well, I hope, and I think that now the situation is quite favorable from this, that it's true that the highest attention was diverted to fight against corona crisis, but I do not think, not only I hope, I do not think that this, serious epidemiological situation can damage the implementation of anti-corruption program. And I can tell you why I think this, and when I think that the government will keep this agenda in its hands during the long period of time, and I hope that it will be successful. Why? Because apart of other reasons which led to the victory of Olano movement in these elections, the corruption was probably the most important. And we know this from opinion polls. Among the voters of Olano, it's a movement of Igor Matovič, 71% voted this subject, this formation, only because of its setup to fight against corruption. 71%. There were some other reasons. If I would have more time, I can elaborate more about, why it happened that Olano won, and we saw, so good results. Yeah, it's really 25%. It's too much for this party. But so it means that it's a kind of promise which first is controllable by the population and controllable by the voters. And Igor Matovič de facto built his political career in probably the last 2-3 months before elections purely on the corruption, anti-corruption agenda. Then when we look to the first measures which this government conducted, and even first laws which were approved, a part of anti-virus agenda, the second agenda, prevailing agenda, was situation in judiciary and anti-corruption measures. So some amendments were already approved, and government police organs of law enforcement organs, they are continuing in all this started either investigation or prosecution or in the courts, the trials. All these inherited corrupt and related with corruption cases, they are still in work, in the process. And then government appointments, government and content of government manifesto, program of the government in these sections on fight against corruption and judiciary system. You can find the really not only the intents, not only the declarations, but the codified measures which will be conducted. Some persons, as I already mentioned, this Mr. Kichura, who was just indicted recently, but I think it now will be really substantial process, the whole process of cleaning up the judicial area, changes in appointment of people who are responsible for law enforcement, either judges or prosecutors or members of different bodies in judiciary. Of course, the control mechanisms in police, because it's not only about judges and prosecutors who were and still are in suspicions of wrongdoings during the previous electoral cycle, but also some policemen. There were some, former, quite highly positioned police officers who were involved in even mafia activities. This agenda, I think, is so dominating, so prevalent in the government, and moreover, it's the area in which all parties have more or less the same opinion, the same positions. There are no discrepancies among them. All of them, before elections, included into the electoral programs these declarations about fight against corruption. And if there were some discrepancies, and there are still some discrepancies, let's say, between more libertarian and more etatist part of the ruling coalition, these discrepancies are visible. But in the area of fight against corruption, they are speaking by one voice, I would say.
And you mentioned these four political parties that are now in the government. They achieved to create a constitutional majority.
It's oversized coalition, and they have 95 seats in the parliament, and the majority which allows to amend the constitution. It's 90 votes. 90 mandates, so they have 95. So it means that they have very comfortable constitutional majority.
But if we consider that these four parties might be acting in one voice, they are definitely not going or in one voice, or opposition to this voice is going definitely be the opposition parties.
Yes,
like Smer Social Democracy or Marian Kotleba's party. what do you think? What is, because I know that Robert Fico, for example, called this governmental program or the program of the government science fiction. Could you maybe speak a little about the role of the opposition parties in this process of anti-corruption measures and so on, or are these parties going to exploit the current crisis also for their own profit when it comes to these anti-corruption measures?
Well, they even try to do this, but I think that it's impossible to be successful on misusing this crisis. Robert Fico criticized one of the laws which was approved by the parliament, and it was law about using the data from mobile communication for identification of the infected persons. So, and he was so, I would say, unpersuasive when just Robert Fico, who was responsible for a lot of wrongdoings, including violations of, I think, some basic norms and the rules of democracy, and he didn't continue. He tried to blame the new government for urgent approval of this law, blaming them that they are restricting human rights, which was really, there were some problems, of course, in phrasing of this law, but how Fico presented the whole case, it was typical for him. Yes, I think that opposition is quite consolidated, I have to say. There is one party which is absolutely anti-systemic. It's this fascist party, Kotleba People's Party of Slovakia. By the way, it's one of quite important moments of the last elections that this party was elected second time in the parliament with even bigger results. In absolute numbers, they gained 20,000 votes more than in the previous elections. In percent, it's maybe...
Then in 2016.
Yes. In percent, it's less than 8% because after the last election, in elections 2016, they have 8%. Now they have 7.9 something. But in absolute numbers, they are stronger today. So it means that this party is established. Now it's established part of party system. It wasn't just the deviation, coincidental deviation of the voting behavior of Slovak population. Now we see that, people who decided to vote for them first time in 2016, when they reached parliament, it wasn't a deviation. It was a very, I would say, informed decision of these people. And we know from opinion polls that this party succeeded to keep the voters from the previous elections. Yeah, so it means that those people are still among them, and now they have some additional voters. And they're in quite consolidated position. No any conflicts within the party. They are very coherent, monolithic, I would say. It's very, as I said, anti-systemic, authoritarian, I would say even totalitarian party. And then Smer. Smer is, of course, it's a special case. Smer was defeated, but he was defeated, in the context of the whole situation, he was defeated with no such bad results. 18% in elections when, especially in the last weeks, there were some declines in support of Smer, but nevertheless they succeeded to have 18%. They have the second biggest parliamentary caucus. According to opinion polls conducted a few days ago, they even now have more. Their rating is higher, so it's 20 and something percent. It's logical because Slovak National Party simply disappeared from political scene, and the voters of this party, I think that partially switched to Smer. Then the party of former Minister of Justice and former Supreme Court Chairman, Mr. Harabin, the Motherland, Vlast Motherland, also they are almost disappeared. And of course, voters of this party, so voters of not only in previous years, left voters, somehow for them, Smer was an appropriate alternative. But now Smer is collecting votes from other unsuccessful parties. We do not have any other left party, so it means that now they are collecting votes from nationalist parties. So it means that from the point of view of their electorate revival, they have these chances, at least survival. I mean, they will survive, I think, in this position in which Robert Fico is still one of the prominent persons, and Peter Pellegrini as a politician with the image of successful manager, because he started to fight against coronavirus. And by the way, also it helped them these three first weeks after the elections, when Pellegrini was presenting his ideas, he communicated with the population. He was appearing in different places, in airport, welcoming the airplanes which delivered the masks from China. I mean, he really quite he used these opportunities for at least neutralization of some damages caused by defeat in the elections. And this party, I think that they have opportunity in some areas to disrupt. I can imagine that they will submit some laws, which, and by the way, you mentioned Smer as a social democratic party. Official name is Social Democracy, but they're not social democratic. They are, even in some issues, they are reactionary. So they're even not enough conservative, they're reactionary. Robert Fico was the main, I would say, face of the fight against Istanbul Treaty. Can you imagine social democracy which is propagating, this kind of agenda? So it means that, and they are pragmatic populists. So then when they will submit some law which will not be codified, or the agenda will not be codified in coalition agreement, in the ruling coalition, and the principle of functioning of this coalition is that there are some areas in which each MP has a free hand in voting. And for example, in issues, Igor Matovič labeled these issues protection of life. So if Fico, let's say, will submit, maybe together with Kotleba's party, the law which is strengthening the provision for, let's say, abortions, then the unity of the ruling coalition can be damaged, can be maybe not destroyed, but it can bring quite high level of tension within the ruling coalition. And of course they will be criticizing. I mean, we know this kind of criticism. Everybody, what is doing your political opponent is bad. But I think that from the point of view of logical arguments, of course, Robert Fico is not the person who will rely on the understanding from the general audience. Yeah, this party still has, let's say, 20% of voters, but among other voters, this disagreement with the and unpopularity of Robert Fico personally is very high. So it will be, I think it will be the battle. It will be the battle, everyday battle in the parliament.
So the only thing which we can hope for is that this battle will be at the very end win by the anti-corruption forces.
Well, anti-corruption, yes. I mean, because it's agenda in which first ruling coalition has a united position, and the second, it's something which is agenda of the executive power. So the opposition cannot now influence. Of course, probably some people close to Smer party, personally close to Smer party, they still in these structures, in police, maybe among judges, among the prosecutors, but these very active proceedings introduced by the new government, these changes of in courts, for composition of courts, some judges voluntarily decided to resign, probably feeling that the clouds under them are somehow concentrating. So it can be also it can be only the verbal attacks, but no tools for the opposition to, let's say, to impede the investigations. Quite the opposite. I think that some people are suspected in wrongdoing. Some political representatives of Smer, maybe not all of them are now still in the politics. Some of them finished their political career, but their presence as a persons, I mean, perceived as a responsible for criminal wrongdoings, I think it will not strengthen very much this party.
Okay, so let's hope that Matovič and his government is going to be successful as possible in his corruption campaign and also with coping with the crisis and so on. At this point, I would like to thank you very much, Mr. Mesežnikov, for your very interesting, very insightful analysis, for sharing your comments on the current situation in Slovakia. And once again, many thanks to you for the opportunity to have you today for our IDMonSite live talk.
Thank you, Daniel, for inviting me. It was my big pleasure, and I hope that we will have opportunity to maybe talk about serious issues either in Slovakia or in some other Central European countries in the future.
Exactly. We hope so as well. And I would like also to to express many thanks to our audience who joined us for our IDMonSite talk today. Subscribe to our YouTube channel IDM Vienna if you have not already done so, and follow us on our social media channels. I wish you all the best to you, Mr. Mesežnikov, and I'm very much looking forward to our next IDMonSite taking place already this Friday. So take care and see you then.